Hello, lovely podcast people. I hope you are well. This podcast is going to be short. I know I've said that before. It's one of those ones where I just have this idea and I thought, this podcast was supposed to be about sharing ideas on the fly, not always preparing too much for them. But especially I think it's helpful for those of you who care about evidence, care about science, care about critical thinking. I try not to be too married to the idea that everyone should think like me. So lots of people become evangelists for their course. Everyone should realize that keto is the best way because I did it. Or, everyone should know that my religion is the best. Or everyone should know that, how amazing CrossFit is. I feel like I mention hate on CrossFit a bit on my podcasts. I really don't dislike CrossFit. So I try not to be too much of an evangelist for some particular course, but I have obviously a bit of a thing for science and evidence and evidence-based practice. But I am accepting, and I created a reel recently about some guy who basically said that females who, his wording was, masturbate their own clitoris on their own or something like that, as though if someone was watching it wouldn't happen. It was a weird podcast. Dr. John's something or other Clay, very strange individual, that they screw up using a vibrator, screw up their kidneys' meridians and it causes them to gain weight. Now, I shared this. It was funny. Everyone found it funny. And I didn't want to make it too boring by then adding to it and going, look, guys, because this is what came into my head. There are people out there, because he was being interviewed on a podcast. There are people out there who have these different beliefs. They believe in, meridians. They believe in woo-woo, not just energy, not just, I feel like you and I have chemistry, which kind of we can explain with science, some of that attraction and endorphin release and whatever. But there are people who just believe stuff that's so unprovable and so outside. It's the spiritual realm. They believe in whatever star signs. Some funny memes out there like, no, you're not a Capricorn. You need to take responsibility for your actions, Debbie. It's funny. But there are people who want to believe in those things and crystals and this, that and the other. And I'm like, you know what? They're not the people who, if you're an evidence-based practitioner, they're not the people you should be trying to convince to work with you necessarily. Don't go after them trying to disprove them. It's people who try to discuss science and misrepresent the science to lie to people, mislead people, make money, that you should kind of call out and correct and create content and help people with. Don't necessarily call out. It's not going to benefit people all that much. Although if people are being misled about masturbation leading to weight gain, I think probably that's a good thing to just go, you know what, this isn't true. Please do not stop your self-care routine. It was mental. You should go find my thing. He was like, stop having sex with robots. Find a man. I can't remember what someone said. When the patriarchy meets something or other, I was like, yeah, this guy meets a guy who can't satisfy women or something. I can't remember. So where were we? Or who feels intimidated by vibrators? Anyway, this is so off topic. The thing I wanted to talk to you about was, I'm passionate about just encouraging some critical thinking. And I do like people to be able to think critically. It frustrates me when people are just and schools should probably be helping teach this, not teaching just this is the answer. I don't know where I said this recently. It was on our revision day, actually, M&E revision day. We had a graduate do another sports nutrition course and qualification, can you call it a qualification course? Bleh, whatever. And they basically got marked wrong from a practitioner perspective and evidence-based working in clinical practice. You would do what she said, but she got marked wrong because it was computer says no, but she didn't. I'll give you the situation. Basically, fiber intake. If you have a client eating next to zero fiber, you wouldn't jump them the very first day you work with them into a place of, meeting the recommendations, say 30 grams of fiber. You probably wouldn't just do that overnight. You might, just because of the amount of fiber, the completely different diet, the discomfort that might cause a client, so you might just taper them up, even if it's literally in 2 stages, 20 and then 30, for instance. And if someone wrote that in an M&U exam, they would get marked right, because it's that's very intelligent thinking, that's high level thinking. She got no, wrong. I can't remember, she said something like 22, and then she'd take them higher. Anyway, ridiculous. I like people to be able to think critically, and I like people to be able to do that based on correct information. And this is a funny reason for me wanting to talk about this on this podcast, because essentially I was watching a woman interviewed on some sort of podcast. It was a very short snippet, and she said something like, she was basically saying women shouldn't sleep around. Women should, other people who were kind of with her and on her side of this sort of debate podcast thing where like women should get married as young as possible. Just stuff that I personally, it's fine if someone believes that, but I'm just like, hell no. Personally, I don't think that's a good life view. And the reasons they were giving was just like a bit odd. I don't think most people would really be comfortable with the reasons they were giving. I don't know. But essentially they were like, look, if a woman has slept with more than 5 men, her likelihood goes from, under 5 men versus more than 5 men goes from a 20% divorce to 80% divorce. Or it was like 80% of people stay in their marriage. And then as soon as it goes over 5, that drops to 20% will stay married. But you get the numbers, right? It's just, she's basically saying if you sleep with more than 5 people, if you have 5 sexual partners, you're ridiculously more likely to get divorced. Your marriage is set to end in failure. And the problem is, and it just triggered me of like, as someone who's fairly sex positive and just doesn't think this kind of, I don't like, I guess the whole religious shame that seems to really be a massive thing in society. And, the whole, I don't know, people call it like slut shaming. And just this whole idea of like, oh, it needs to be such a taboo subject and it's kind of sex education's terrible in schools and all that kind of jazz. I guess it's in one way, I feel like I'm forward thinking. I don't like to ever identify with woke culture or the woke crowd, but just this basically British repressed religious trauma that people walk around with and is just weird, personally, I think. So I guess that's the reason it's jumped out at me of like, my goodness, this woman is saying this basically as a fact and as a causative fact. So the whole point of this podcast is not to dwell on I'm not doing a podcast on sexual, what's the word? Experimentation, freedom. What's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, now this is that point where you all shout things at your device playing this podcast. Basically the 80s, right? The hippie thing. Anyway, I am annoyed at myself. Anyway, where are we? It's not the point of this podcast. The podcast is to discuss causation. So what they are showing there, and you see this with all sorts of different things, like you can find all of these funny correlations between, number of pirates in the sea and autism cases, for instance. And it's like this negative correlation. It's like, oh, pirates stop autism. Like, it's ridiculous. There's lots of different funny ones you can Google. You've also got like reverse causation, where actually you think X, like A, causes B. So an example would be like the link that has been found between artificial sweeteners and weight gain or higher BMI, So in studies where we can really look more at causation, so this whole thing that you've heard it before, correlation does not equal causation. If we are able to control for variables, we can go, we've controlled for all of the known variables that might impact this outcome, and then we're going to do an intervention and we're going to blind our subjects so they're not impacted by placebo or other variables. And then we go, oh, look. And then we run statistics and we go, oh, we are more than 95% certain that the reason we've seen this outcome, say higher body weight or weight gain, is because of whatever we did to our subjects, our intervention. Then you get, so that's a randomized control trial, double blind, this, that, and the other. Then what we can do is we can just get a whole group of people, 100,000 people, and go, do you drink diet drinks? And they go, yes or no. And then you weigh them. And you just chuck that data and you go, oh, loads of people drinking diet drinks had higher weight. Diet drinks cause people to gain weight or be heavier or have more body fat or whatever. And you completely disregard the idea that actually people might be drinking diet drinks because they believe that will be helpful to them to not put as much weight on, to weigh less. They may be dieting, etc., etc. And we do have randomized control trials where people consume sugar-free diet, artificially sweetened beverages, and it helps them to lose weight. So we are able to say, actually, our stronger evidence of causation does not fit in line with this hypothesis that the diet drinks were causing people to have the higher weight. I used to, when I was teaching very elementary science, it was like, if you turned up to every fire and you saw a fireman, you might conclude that firemen caused fires, and you'd be wrong. So that's why science is fantastic, because we can control for these variables. And so that's like reverse causation. And there's just other correlations that we see, like there's a recent paper actually on the sweetener front. sweetener intake and cancer risk, I believe. Now, mechanistically, this is a very weak idea based on all of our human evidence. But I believe there was statistically, small but significant increase in risk, about 13%, I think it was, in the media headlines anyway. It's another situation of, okay, we're using inaccurate dietary records to look at something. We're also not understanding why they're consuming these things at what time point, and then over a time period of years, it's like, oh, they seem to be at slightly higher risk of cancer. But it's not a case of like, well, because we know there are lots of obesity linked cancers, that sort of thing, being in excess energy. Again, there are confounding variables where when you see this sort of non-intervention based studies where we can't really talk about causation, and there are realistic ideas why it might be flawed, we can't get there. But obviously people jumped on that bandwagon and go, yeah, see, if you drink a diet drink, you're going to get cancer. It did provide food for thought. I will say that. It was interesting, but realistically, I literally have a can of artificially sweetened energy drink here. It's not put me off, and I do try and make fairly good choices. Anyway, where was I? So basically, are there other hypotheses that we could create for someone having more than 5 sexual partners, and a reason that they end up in a situation where were they someone that a particular type of person, and being that type of person led them to having more sexual partners, and that same initial reason, X, caused Y and Z. But Y and Z are not related. Anyway, just look out for these things in society where you see people going, did you know that if you do this, you're more likely? It's like, but it's not a causative correlation. You've just seen 2 things and then they need to be tested. And try and say to yourself, are there other possible reasons this would be the outcome? I suppose this is a good podcast, actually. I was a bit unsure about recording this because there was this one fine point, and it was based on me watching something that's really nothing that I have particular expertise in, but do have a big interest in the area of sex positivity and that kind of stuff. I guess it's the most woke place area of my life, of like being non-judgmental about people's personal decisions, both males and females, and also just like an area I really get dragged into where it's just like, oh, we don't use slut shame, but then it's like on the other hand, it's like, oh, you're a boy. Anyway, correlation does not equal causation. That is the point of this podcast, helping with your critical thinking. I'll leave it there until let me know what you think. Please rate the podcast. Maybe don't rate it based on this one. Is it good? We're on episode 90 something now. In general, like it's a 4 or a 5. Come on. I think. Until next time, much love.